All right, so in this lesson, we're going to do a couple of things that I was promising from the last one. We're going to do a little bit of cleanup first, and we're also going to take a little bit deeper look at what to do with those exceptions, okay? So let's start off with the quick and easy things here. A couple of little cosmetic fixes that I would like us to do. The first one is the fact that we've got these broken images here, and these are for records that don't actually have an image associated with them, but our HTML code currently tries to render an image for every single person, whether or not there was one uploaded for that person. So let's address that real quick. So let's jump into the people.html here. And let's see here. So let me make a little room. Okay, so let's go to our table. Here's our table. And if we go to the photo field here, which is this table cell right here, what we can do is simply make this image tag optional or conditional, right? So basically we can say, if there is a photo file name associated with this particular person, then render this image element here. Otherwise, just don't render it at all. And we've actually done this before or something like it. We used the th:\if attribute. Let's see, I don't remember where we did it, but that's okay. We'll do it again right here. So here's our image tag. And so what we can do, I'm going to put a space there and then do a th:\if equals, and then our little curly brace, $ curly braces. And then all we have to do is refer to the person dot, what was it, photo file name? Photo file name. And so what this is going to do is, if the photo file name for a given person is not null, then this if statement will evaluate to true, and then the image element will be rendered. However, if the photo file name is null, then this if statement will evaluate to false, which will in turn cause this image element to be erased from the final rendered HTML, okay? And so let's update. Hey, and look at that over here. Those broken images disappeared, but these ones remained because obviously there's something actually associated with them. And so that looks a lot better already. Then another thing that we can address, so my wife is a financial advisor, and she happened to walk by one day when I was working on this, and she saw this salary field here, and she said, "You are going to make that right justified, aren't you?" And honestly, I didn't really care that much, but let's make my wife happy and right justify these currency amounts, okay? And this is pretty easy to do as well. Now, to do this, we're going to use Bootstrap, and Bootstrap has CSS classes that will allow us to very easily align text. And let me just show you how to find that, by the way. So if you go into your Bootstrap documentation and you go up to search docs, you can type in text, and look at that right there, text alignment. And that is exactly what we want. And here are some examples of basic text alignment. So we've got some text that's left aligned, centered, or right aligned. Now they call it start, center, and end, however, okay, start, center, and end. And then here's the actual code for those. So here they say they use a class of text-start, text-center, text-end. So we can use this text-end to right align those currency amounts, okay? So let's jump back over here. Let's find that field, which is right here. And so what we can do is just add a class right on to the TD. Class equals text-end. And let's reload. Hey, and look at that. And that does look better, actually. And now my wife can be happy. All right. And so now let's talk about this big one here, those exceptions, right? So here's what I want to do. First, let us consider a scenario which would cause certain types of exceptions to be thrown, okay? And I think we were looking at exception-related issues that had to do with the file storage, right? So let's jump into that class, the file storage repository, and remember what we've got going on in here. All right, so let's see. So yeah, we're doing these try catches because anytime we're dealing with kind of like file access and stuff like that, you can get various exceptions such as an IO exception. Here we're doing something with a URL resource, and so we had to handle this malformed URL exception right there. Okay, so we've got a few issues like that. So how can we test this via our UI? What are some good ways that we can kind of test what would happen if these exceptions were actually being thrown, right? Well, one technique that I was thinking of is the fact that we have this storage folder here, which I will remind you is being injected by Spring from an environment variable called storage folder. And this folder has to exist on the computer in order for any of this to work, okay? Even down here where we do path.of. If this folder does not exist, this is going to blow up, okay? So what I was thinking is that we could temporarily change the location of this folder to some place that does not exist on the computer and then run the application, and that would definitely cause some exceptions to be thrown, okay? So that's the first step that I want to do here. And so let's go ahead and just stop the application. All right, so we'll stop that. Then I'm going to jump into the edit configurations. All right. And down here where we set the environment variables, and we've got this one right here, storage folder, set on my computer, set to users Terry uploads, and hopefully it's something different that is meaningful for your computer. So what I'm going to do though is I'm just going to put a 2 behind this because that's a folder that does not exist on my computer at this time. Users Terry uploads 2. So I'm just going to change it to that. And I apologize again, I'm in presentation mode, so you can't see my apply and run buttons, but again, I promise you that they are there. So I'm going to click apply to apply that change to this configuration. And then I'm going to go ahead and click run from here to actually get that configuration running. Okay. All right, so basically I'm restarting up the application with this new configuration. And so now if I come back over here to the browser and I reload this page, yes, those images are now broken because now they are trying to be retrieved from that uploads to folder, which does not actually exist on my computer. And we're now getting a bunch of exceptions as a result of that, okay? All right, so let me minimize that again. And now we can do something here. So we kind of touched on this a bit in the database section, where I think towards the end of that section, we created a custom exception that extended runtime exception. And then we had similar code like this, which was modified to throw our new custom exception. And that's actually what I would recommend doing in this case as well. And let me just remind you again. So you've got, generally speaking, 2 types of exceptions that you can draw from. You've got checked exceptions, and then you've got runtime or unchecked exceptions, okay? Checked exceptions are generally those exceptions which you should be able to do something about, okay? So if, for example, if you attempted to make a network connection to some server to retrieve some data, and your attempt to connect to that server resulted, let's say, in a checked exception of some sort, perhaps you could have a try catch block where you catch that checked exception, and then you can use that checked exception to inform your code that it should wait a few seconds and then try it again, for example, right? And maybe in that way, you may be able to recover from that particular exception. On the other hand, runtime exceptions are generally exceptions that you are not expected to be able to recover from. And because you're not expected to be able to recover from them, Java does not force you to catch those types of exceptions, okay? So in this particular case now, if this environment variable is set to a folder that happens to not exist on the computer, is that something that our code can do anything about? There's a good chance that realistically speaking, no, there may not really be much that you can do about it, especially if this application were running on an actual server. On our computers, we maybe could write some code that would see that that folder doesn't exist, and then maybe the code would actually attempt to create that folder first and then store the files there. You might be able to do that. However, if this application were deployed to a server, that would probably be an inappropriate thing to even attempt to do. And if the server administrator is really on top of things like they probably should be, they probably shouldn't allow your Java code to be able to create a whole entire folder somewhere that the administrator did not intend for you to have, okay? So let's say that the administrator had defined that environment variable incorrectly, okay? And so it points at a folder that just doesn't exist. Chances are the only way to get that kind of problem resolved is for the administrator to be made aware that that issue is existing and then to fix it and then restart the application, okay? So in that case, there would not be any code-centric solution for that problem, okay? The application is just gonna have to be stopped. The proper folder will have to be created. The environment variable will have to be reset, and then the application has to be restarted, okay? That would be the solution for that. So if we assume that that is kind of the scenario here, I would say that in that type of case, we can create a custom runtime exception, okay, to perhaps cover that type of scenario, all right? So let us create a runtime exception. So we could just start by doing that right here in this catch block. And in that case, we probably should not be printing this stack trace the way that we're doing here. And I will say a little bit more about that in a moment, okay? So instead, what I would probably do is simply say throw new, and then come up with a new exception type, okay? And because I don't feel like thinking real hard right now, I'm just going to create a new exception called storage exception, like so. Now, of course, this is in red right now because that new exception doesn't actually exist. So I will put my cursor here, do an option return, and I will allow the IDE to create this exception by choosing the first option here, create class storage exception. Now it's asking me where should this exception be put. And for right now, I think we'll just make a new package called exception. And then click OK. All right, and so the IDE understood that whatever we're creating here in this context has to be something that is throwable, so it already has extended throwable for us. That's a good start, but that's not quite what we want. So I already just mentioned that I think in this particular case, what we will want is a runtime exception. And so we will have this actually extend runtime exception, like so. And then the other thing that we may want to do though, let's jump back over here. Okay, so now that red error went away. So the other thing now that we may want to do though is we might not want to lose the originating exception that actually occurred here, which is this E. And I think we did this as well in the database section where we made a new custom exception, but we allowed that exception's constructor to accept a source exception, okay? So in other words, we'd like our storage exception here to be able to take that E. And the reason we'd want to be able to do that is so that we don't lose the full trace of what actually occurred, okay? So we can kind of keep that chain of exceptions going, okay? By wrapping the previous exception in our new one. So let's jump back into this new exception though and make it actually capable of accepting a source exception, if you will. So I will make a new line here, and then I will do a command N to add a new constructor. And so the IDE is presenting me with all of the constructors of the runtime exception, okay? And so I can choose any of these. For now, I'm just gonna select them all because I don't really wanna even think about it too much. So I will select them all and then click OK. And so now we're delegating up to each of the runtime exception's own constructors, like so. And then if we jump back over here now, so now the little red squiggly went away and we're passing in the IO exception in this particular case. And then down here, we could do the same thing as well. Although this method is more for finding than for storing, but that's okay. This is just kind of for example purposes anyway. So we could do something along those same lines, throw new storage exception, and then pass in the E. Now, as soon as we do that, we no longer require this explicit return statement here, because as long as a method is either returning whatever data type that method is defined to return or throwing an exception, the method will be satisfied, okay? And so we can get rid of that now. Now, please note, you could have many custom exception types, okay? Just somewhat out of laziness right now, and because I'm only showing you some examples of things that we could do, I'm only creating this one. But if you really analyze these scenarios and you determined that you might want a different type of custom exception, or even multiple different types of exceptions to be thrown based on different types of situations or circumstances, you could absolutely do that, okay? All right, so there's our new exception though. And so now the question is, what can we do with this, right? So first off, let's reload. Okay, so we've reloaded. And so now let's just see what happens with the behavior of our application when we're now explicitly rethrowing an exception under this circumstance in particular. So first off, let's just reload this page. Okay, so the page reloads fine. Now we did get some stack traces happening over here, but the page itself is still fine. These stack traces are presumably due to the fact that the find by name method is executing and trying to find these files, and they don't exist. And so exceptions are being thrown and we're seeing stack traces here, but the UI is fine. All right, so now let's see what happens if we try to create a new person and upload a new photo, okay? So I will just call this person test 1/1/2000 test at test.com with a salary of 2,000. And let's go find a picture. I'll do Jake Nakos, and let's upload that and see what we get. Ah, okay. Now we've seen this kind of page before, right? This so-called white label error page. So now I'm going to explain a little bit more about this page. So what we're seeing here is a default error page that Spring provides to us, which we will get if any exception ends up being thrown ultimately out of our controller handler methods and it is uncaught. So I've mentioned now a few times already that this is actually pretty bad. You don't really want this happening because you really don't want end users seeing, in particular, any hints about the file system of your server, okay? And our application essentially is a server, okay? So we don't want to be sharing this kind of information with them. And in general, you don't want to be sharing the stack trace either. I mean, no one who's non-technical wants to, see this. It would scare them and they wouldn't understand it. So let me first show you real quickly something that we can do alternatively to just prevent this from even happening, okay? So the way that this is working is that by default, if such an exceptional circumstance occurs, then our application will automatically take the end user to a /error page, okay? Now this page does not physically exist within our code. We didn't create this. This is just default behavior that we're getting out of the box, okay? So there is no, let's see, where are we here? So there is no error page that exists physically within our project, okay? So this is generated more like in code, okay? But we can hijack this and do something a little bit nicer. And one way that you can do this with the skills that you've already learned here is to simply create your own error page. So we could come over here to templates, make a new HTML page. You can call it whatever you like, by the way. I mean, it probably makes sense maybe to call it error.html, but it doesn't actually have to be called error, and I'll show you why in just a moment, right? But I'm going to create one and call it error for now. And let's make some room here, and I will just call this error page. And for now, I will say something went horribly, terribly wrong. Please try again. Okay, now if I open back up the project pane here, notice that I put this file under the templates folder. And because it's under the templates folder, that means that it is going to need a controller in order for it to work, okay? And so what we can do is come up here and go ahead and just create an error controller for this. Now, this is just one way that you can do this, and it's one way that makes use of the techniques that you've already learned in this section, and so that's why I'm showing you in this way. All right, so we can make a new Java class, and we'll call it error controller. And I will close all that other stuff in. So then we'll annotate it as a controller, and then we can put a request mapping on it. Now, for this request mapping, we can state what URL mapping will cause this error controller to be called. Can you guess what that should be? Well, it should be error. Or you could also prepend that with a / error, but remember I was saying that you actually don't require that. All right, so you can do that. And then we can create a simple public method that returns a string, and we can say something like get error page, like so. And then we can simply return the name of our view, which in this case is error. And so we could have named that view anything, and this would still work because we could just refer to whatever the name. So we could have called it doggy if we wanted to. And as long as we said doggy here, anytime the browser tries to navigate to / error, the doggy page would have shown up, right? But it probably makes more sense to name that file something that's kind of more related to what it's actually doing, right? And then, of course, we will also need to annotate this method as with a get mapping, all right? And so if we just do those changes right there and reload, there you go. There's our error message. And so let's just go through that whole entire flow from the user perspective one more time, just to prove that that is actually working the way that we wanted it to. All right, so here we are, brand new on the page, and we will create another person. Now that test person, by the way, did not get created because an exception was thrown. And since that exception was thrown, nothing got stored into the database or any of that kind of stuff at all, okay? But just in case, I will just use another person's name, test2. Test2 at test.com, 3000. I will use the same person though, and save person. There we go. And so now we at least are no longer showing that scary, ugly stack trace that we were showing before. And now we've taken control of what the end user would actually see. Now, in real life, if you were going to do this, you'd probably at least want to decorate it nicely and, make it friendly, and maybe even give them a little link or something that they could click on to go back to the home page or the beginning, or, something of that sort. But I think you get it. So the other thing that's nice about this solution is that it can be used to cover exceptions that you don't even know are capable of being thrown throughout your application. So you never have to worry that some unexpected exception that you can't anticipate is going to result in a scary stack trace being presented to your end users that you can't control for, okay? So this page would become the catch-all error page for any and all exceptions that get past you, okay? All right, so that's one really nice technique that you can use. Now, let us also consider, let me go back to the main page here. Now, let's say that somehow you could anticipate that your server administrator gets a little drunk from time to time and sometimes forgets to set that environment variable, and you can't get him fired. You just have to work with him, but you know that this happens every couple of months. And so you just decide, you know what? I'm just going to anticipate that he's going to get drunk one night and he's going to forget to set that variable. Now, why he would need to set that variable over and over and over again is a completely different question, but let's just pretend like he has to keep resetting that variable every month or so. And some months he forgets to, and you don't want your end users to have a really poor experience, okay? And so let's say that you would like your end users, if that should occur, that they will fill out this form and click the Save Person button, and you don't even want them to have to see that catch-all error page, but instead you want them to just return to this page and see all their stuff filled out still, kind of like when they don't have proper validation, except you would like to just give them a nice little message here that just says something about, sorry, for right now, you're not going to be able to upload an image or something along those lines, okay? So let's see how we could do that. So let's jump back over to the people controller, and this would be in the save person method, right? So one thing you could do in that case is you can always use a try catch block within the controller method itself. You can always do that. I'm not a big fan of having to do it, but if you have to, then you have to, right? And so what you could do here is to anticipate that if this server administrator forgets to set that environment variable correctly or to create the correct folder or whatever, you could perhaps consider doing a try catch around this block of code. And in fact, let's just do that real quick just to see what that would look like. Now I'm going to tell you now that what I'm about to show you isn't super great, and I will point out exactly why in just a moment, but this is again somewhat for illustrative purposes, okay? So we can now try and catch this. And if we know what we're looking for, then we can even be a little more specific and say, okay, let's catch the, what did I call it? Storage exception, right? And we're not going to print that. But instead, what we want to do is we want to return them back to this page here with all their data filled in. So you could do a return people, right? And if you're not doing a redirect, then they are going to get whatever they already had filled in repopulated on the page, right? Just by doing this, okay? And let's also say that we want to convey a more specific error message to them on this page, right? So to convey that message, let's say that that message is coming from our code here. So if that's the case, that the message is coming from our code here, then one way that we can convey that message is by binding it to a model. And we currently are not using a model on this method, but we can easily do that by simply telling Spring to inject a model into this method, right? And so we can come down here and then we can say model.add attribute, and then we will name this attribute. I will call it maybe error message for now. And then we can maybe bind a string or something like system is currently unable to accept photo files at this time. Okay, so whatever you want to say there. And then we'll go over to the template and we will allow that message to be shown if it exists, right? So maybe we'll put that message right above the person form. So let's go find, there's the person form right there. Now let's go over to Bootstrap and see what kind of nicer way can we present such a message. All right, so over here in the docs, in the documentation, I think under components, alerts, they've got some kind of nice little alert components basically that we can use. And I'm kind of thinking, since this would be an alert for something kind of like not great, perhaps we'll make it use this danger one here. And so we can find the HTML for this guy, which is right here. And I will just copy that and all in a div. And then we'll come over here and paste that like so. All right. And then to control the text that's in here, I think you should know what we're going to use, right? A th:\text equals $ curly braces, and we bound that to error MSG, right? And then now we won't want this to show up all the time. We only want this to show up if there actually is an error message. And so we can just put a th:\if in here as well, just like we did up earlier, right? So th:\if equals just like so, and then the same thing, error message. Okay, so if there is an error message, then display this div with everything in it, okay? Like so. All right, and then let's reload. Okay, and then let's try this again and see what we end up with. So I will do test 3, 1, 2000, test 3 at test.com. with a salary of 4,000 and point to a photo, Jake Nakos, and save this person. Ah, look at that. So now we return to the original page, right? But now we're seeing this message, system is currently unable to accept photo files at this time, okay? And then here's all our data. Now, one thing that we can't repopulate is the file that we uploaded. But actually, that's probably good since this particular issue has to do with the fact that we're not able to accept these uploaded files anyway. That's actually fine. So in this case, they should just be able to click Save Person. Yep, and now you get that test 3 person. Oh, and I see I had a little typo there before, right? Because now we didn't even attempt to upload a proper person anyway. So that at least gives you a couple of ideas of ways that you might be able to handle exceptions. There are actually a few other techniques. Maybe I'll just talk about one real quick, but I don't know that I want to go into much detail on it right now. Again, this is just an intro. Let me jump back over to the people controller. So I will just tell you this. It is also possible to create what are called exception handler methods themselves. And okay, I won't run this, but I will show you what it looks like, or what it can look like at least. So you can make a method handle exception. Okay, and then you can actually annotate this method with something called exception handler. And then in this exception handler now, you can actually specify exceptions that can cause this method to be called. Okay, so in our case, we could refer to our storage exception.class like so. And basically what this is telling Spring is, if a storage exception is thrown and not handled, so in this case it is being handled, right, by our try catch here. So in this particular case, this would not get called. But if we were not catching and handling this storage exception in this particular case, or if some other methods were not handling the storage exception, then Spring would end up calling this method, and then you could do a lot of the same types of things that you do in any other handler. So we could state, for example, to go to some particular view and show that view alternatively, or just directly return some data, kind of like the way we're doing up here with this response entity. So you could do a lot of different things, okay? And this exception handler method approach here is very, very flexible. So if you have an exception hierarchy, like a set of exceptions that extend from other exceptions, you could state some higher level parent exception in that hierarchy. And this method could be called for any of the exceptions within that hierarchy if you set it up that way. Okay. And there's a lot of things you could do there. So, and you can also pass in a good number of the same types of parameters that you can pass into some of these other handler methods or model attribute methods and things of this sort. Okay. So very, very flexible set of techniques. Okay. Let me see. Now I wanted to also just briefly mention a little bit more about what I don't like about this try catch block here within our handler method. One thing that's bad about this particular approach is the way that I'm doing it here is the fact that I'm returning people here, but I'm also returning it here. If I wanted to spend a little more time thinking this through a little better, which I don't want to do, I can tell you right now that I'm sure I could come up with a better way of doing this where I wouldn't have this duplication. Okay, so you probably understand now from me throughout this course that duplication of this sort is kind of bad. Now in this case, I'm not saying duplication is necessarily bad because of one line. I'm saying it more because of the logic of it. Okay, basically my logic says there are two ways that I might want to just return you back to the previous people page. So it would be better if I could come up with a way to code this where I could say something like, if there are errors or if there is an exception, then return people, right? That would be better. And maybe that would simply involve me flipping this logic around so that I'm not saying if there aren't errors, then do this. Maybe instead I should be saying if there are errors, then do some things, right? Something along those lines. So I would leave that to you as an exercise though, but I just wanted to point that out that this isn't great what I'm doing here. I just didn't feel like thinking it through a whole lot more right now. Okay, so that was all I wanted to show there. So real quick before we end this lesson, let's jump back over. Actually, first let me stop my server. And I'm doing that currently with a command F2. You can do a control F2 as well. I'm going to stop the server. Then let's open back up the edit configurations, and let's put that back the way it was. I don't want to forget to do that. All right, and then I'm going to apply, and I'm going to go ahead and just run it again. Oh yeah, and I forgot to get rid of this as well. Let me get rid of that. And let me try that again now. And run. And just make sure that that's still working. Very good. Okay, so I've got my 3 people there. Now this one got uploaded in kind of a weird state because the record in the database actually does refer to that person, but we know that the actual file never got uploaded. And so this is in a weird state, which is something else that we're going to likely want to address in maybe in the next lesson or 2 anyway, okay? So anyway, that's all we needed to do for now to get this back into working order mostly, all right? And so I will see you in the next one. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and you'd like to help me out, there are several ways you could do that. First, you can always click the like and subscribe. That'll help me out a lot. Additionally, another way you can help me out is to check the link in the description below. That'll link you to my website where you can find additional courses. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in starting a new career as a professional software developer, I offer a free PDF guide that will detail exactly how you can get started in this field with no college degree and no prior experience. All you need to do is click on the link in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.